Welcome to Michigan Public's talk on our new documentary. It's called The Bird Connection. I'm Lester Graham.
I'm Rebecca Williams.
And we're going to be talking about that for a while. We want to welcome you all. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. Nice, good crowd here. Thank you for those of you who are joining us online. We appreciate that. So this project started literally last May. We started talking about it. I started doing some recordings, and we've been trying to discuss how we're going to do it. But it all started with having to persuade the funders that we could go ahead and do this, because I'm on a grant with the Mott Foundation. For 4 years now, I've been covering things like drinking water, affordability, septic tanks and sewers and overflows and pollution and all that stuff. And I called them up and I said, hey, I've got an idea. It's a little off topic, but I want to do a documentary about birds and how polluted water affects them. And she said, oh my gosh, I'm a birder. That's a great idea. And so that was the easiest sell of my life ever with a funder. That was fun. So we started working on that right away. Now, the reason I wanted to do that is my hobby is wildlife photography. All the photos you see up here, almost all the photos up here, are ones I took. And so where I live is in the Irish Hills area. And so I don't have a lot of elk there. There are no moose, but there are a lot of wetlands and marshes and water birds, shorebirds, fish-eating birds, a lot of eagles. And I got to thinking, we've heard about songbirds and the decline because of a study that was out that Rebecca's going to talk about it, but we don't know really very much about what's going on with shorebirds, with fish-eating birds, with all of these other birds that I care about, like great blue herons and green herons and great egrets and things like that, kingfishers. But what really got our attention actually happened 5 years ago when this big report from Audubon and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a couple other characters.
Cornell Lab of Ornithology, a lot of names you may have heard, put out a study in 2019. And they found that since 1970, we have lost almost 3 billion birds. And those losses are mostly among grassland birds and shorebirds, and birds that live in forests. At the same time, waterfowl, certain kinds of waterfowl are doing better.
Yeah. The one thing about that 3 billion is a really big figure. You know, billions are hard to really understand. But what we're talking about is 1 in 3 birds. 1/3 of the entire bird population in North America that was there in 70 was gone by just 5 years ago. That's a huge number of birds. Didn't want to interrupt.
I don't know. So at the same time, certain kinds of waterfowl, raptors and turkeys are doing better, but there are a lot of reasons why birds are on the decline, and even not just rare birds, but common birds are also declining.
Yeah, we've been looking at that, and you know, one of the ones that really surprised me, we found out from Cornell, gray blue herons and not sandpipers, killdeer are both declining. They're very, very common. Why would they be declining? And so that's what we wanted to look into, and it's been eye-opening.
And so another thing that really made me want to jump in on this project with Lester is that you probably know that birds are considered sentinel species, right? You've all heard about the canary in the coal mine, and miners used to carry canaries into the mines in the early 1900s with them. And if the canary died, the miners knew that they should not stay in the mine because the gases were dangerous at dangerous levels. Well, what we found in our reporting is that that is still very much true about the environment, and things that happen to birds also can affect us. And so that's a lot of what we get into in the documentary.
Yeah, it's amazing. You know, if birds are suffering because there's polluted water in the Great Lakes, well, your kids are swimming in those lakes. You know, if birds are losing habitat, that means that the water that would be filtered through wetlands is not being filtered anymore. It's being, rushed to wherever it's going. That might be the Great Lakes. It might be your local inland lake. So there's a lot of things that are happening to birds. It doesn't take much imagination to realize this is affecting my life too. And so we want to really make that connection. And that's why we call it the bird connection. That, and it's easy to remember. So anyway, Rebecca said, I want to tell you a little bit about us, first of all. I've been working at Michigan Radio, Michigan Public since 1998. She was hired, as young as she is, she was hired just 2 years later.
Oh, 2000, actually.
Yeah.
Well, you said
98,
okay.
Yeah, 2000. And she was an intern. Now she's my editor, so she's done fairly well. I'm still in the same place, it's still just reporting. And so she actually did the environment report solo for 8 years. She kept bringing you all the stories in the state that were important to hear on environmental issues solo for a really, really long time. So I thought that was an incredible effort. So now then when she said, I'd like to get involved in this project, I'm going, oh yeah, we need that, because together we have 40 years of experience just covering the environment. That's a lot. That's rare these days when it comes to environmental coverage.
Yeah, and I have to say it's been a great change to be an editor in the newsroom, but I missed environmental reporting, so it was great to get back into that.
So we talked about this. One of the things I really wanted to do is, if you're going to get, there are people who are interested in birds, and then there are birders, right? And we wanted to make sure that we reached out to the birders in a way that they would really say, oh, they did their homework. And the two groups that we really wanted to talk to, aside from like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and all the other folks, are the folks at Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and we wanted to talk to Audubon, and both of them said, yeah, we'll work with you on this. And so they were really helpful, guided us. In fact, Cornell University itself, we were thinking we were going to go there and interview maybe 3 people, 4 people. We ended up interviewing 7 people. Not all of them are in the documentary, but they'll be on future stories. And it was really just encouraging that they really work with us. And I have to tell you, I don't always have a great relationship with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. Sometimes they're right there, they're on it. Sometimes they're really difficult to reach the right people. And when I called them on this, they were all in. And they gave me the names of people that I should be talking to. And one of them turned out to be spectacularly valuable. It's the pathologist, wildlife pathologist that works for the DNR. And she was frank and really, really enlightening in finding out what's going on with these birds. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But we work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Audubon, Great Lakes, Wisconsin DNR, Michigan DNR, Pennsylvania DNR, the University of Minnesota, MSU, U of M, the Ohio Wetland Alliance, and all of them were really, really passionate about this project as well. So we feel like we hit something, at least with the people who are actively looking into this, because it doesn't get that much attention.
Yeah, and I don't know, probably you may be aware that cats are a big threat to birds, but there are a lot of other things that can lead to these declines. Flying into electrical lines is one, being poisoned, being hit by cars and trucks, and colliding with building windows. These are the threats that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service names as the top active threats, so things that can cause sudden death. But what we get into in the documentary is more of the passive threats. So we're looking at habitat loss, disease, and pollution.
Yeah, disease has been, it's a much larger issue than I thought it was. I don't know if you remember, but 2 years ago, 1,500 Caspian terns were found dead on 3 islands in Lake Michigan, a couple of them in Wisconsin, one of them in Michigan's side of the border. And nobody was, like, they were like, what is going on? Because they walked, in fact, the guy who was working for the Wisconsin DNR, a guy named Sumner Madison, walked into that. He said he had never seen anything so devastating in his life. to see dead birds, large dead birds, as far as he could see on that island. He was really, really concerned about it and wondering, how does this happen? So the test came back, and it was highly pathogenic avian influenza, bird flu. And it was one of the biggest die-offs of avian flu of wild birds, because wild birds have always had that virus, but it's never really affected them in any significant way. Now suddenly something's changed, and wild birds are starting to die from it. It's mutated somehow. We're also seeing, the same year, 86 million poultry, domestic poultry, died because of avian flu. We saw last year that dairy cattle now have bird flu. Two instances now, we've had 2 people who contracted bird flu from dairy cattle. And we just saw in the newspapers today that there were 3 dairy cattle herds in Michigan that now have bird flu. So again, it started out as one thing that affected the birds. Suddenly it's at our doorstep. We're looking at something that's a very, very serious problem. And we've got what the pathologists and the physicians call COVID exhaustion. We're tired of being worried about the next bug that's going to come along and get us. But this one is dead serious. This is a big, big problem, because the mortality rate on this new type of avian flu is really, really high. We're talking about, for some species, 53% mortality rate. Can you imagine half a flock, half a type of bird just dies suddenly? And so that's something to be worried about. I'm not trying to make you all worried about getting bird flu, but if somebody starts spreading it around, if there's ever human to human contact, you'll definitely want to be wearing your masks then. The other one is botulism, which has a really complicated story, and you've covered a lot of that over the years. So how many different cases of that?
Well, actually, I'm going to throw that back to you, Lester, because you did the more recent reporting on that. But I think, we've certainly seen, I know that I've reported on a number of instances where botulism has killed birds in the Sleeping Bear Dunes region, and maybe you've seen birds washing up on shore. And the reasons behind that are pretty complicated. Some of the theories are connected to invasive species.
Yeah, so we're talking about type E botulism. There's another type C that also bothers birds. But this started happening, we started seeing birds dying off in the 1960s, and it got worse. And they were trying to figure out, it took them almost 30 years to kind of put all the pieces of the puzzle together. But basically, zebra mussels and quagga mussels came in through the ballast water of cargo ships from Eastern Europe. They ended up just blanketing the bottom of the lakes. I mean, there are trillions and trillions and trillions of these mussels, right? And they're filtering through, and in the same time, algae is dying and falls down there, and their pseudo feces is what they call it, kind of collects down there, and that makes an anaerobic, an oxygen low environment. Botulism loves that. Botulism really got, on fire there. Then we had another invasive species called the round goby, which is a fish. And it also is from Eastern Europe, and it likes to eat those mussels. It was also contracting the toxin from botulism. And so they were easy prey for the birds, and the birds would eat those fish, and then they'd become infected. And it's a really horrible, I feel like I'm telling really bad stories. We're going to get to some good stuff later. It's a really horrible death, because basically these birds get to the point where they cannot hold their head up any longer, and it falls into the water and they drown. Either that, or they can't move at all, and they'll just bounce on the water until they starve to death. So botulism has been a horrible thing, and it comes in waves, it seems like. We're starting to realize that one thing those mussels are doing is filtering a lot of the organisms in the water out, so the water's clearer. The sun can reach down farther, more algae can grow, and therefore there's more dead algae at the end that ends up helping make this anaerobic situation. And the other thing that they've made a correlation with, they don't know exactly what the cause is, but apparently warmer water also is contributing to the spread of botulism. So climate change is another factor. And they don't know what to do about this. How do you deal with all those factors? Those mussels aren't going away. They're there. The botulism is feeding on this situation, this anaerobic situation. They're there. About the only thing that anybody can do at this point is volunteers go around with their nitrile gloves on, picking up dead birds so other animals and other birds don't eat them. And that's the only thing we can do to slow the spread of botulism. The other botulism is botulism C, which they're still working on, but you guys know what dabbling ducks are? Ducks that just eat from the surface. They don't dive down or anything like that. They just kind of, mallards are a really good example. They just kind of eat vegetation at the surface. Well, they'll get around the sediment, and there's botulism C in the sediment on the edge of the water. And so it's not killed as many ducks and other dabbling fowl as botulism E has, but it's another concern. So we've got these two botulism things going on, which is surprising to me. I knew about the one, I did not know about the other, and I didn't know just how bad the botulism E was getting. It is a pretty constant thing. Some years we have just a few birds. What was it, 2 years ago at Sleeping Bear Dunes? You had a botulism outbreak there.
Yeah, you're putting me on the spot. Something in the hundreds.
600.
600, I think.
It was 600, yeah. So we're looking at all this disease. We're trying to figure out, how can we report on that? And the fact is, there's no good solution. We don't have a solution. Nobody has a solution. Everybody's working on it. They're scared to death on what it's doing to the waterbird population, and also the grassland and songbird population, because they've been picking up bird flu as well. And it's just getting to the point that nobody knows what to do. They're all studying it. They're looking into it, but there's no easy answer. It's just contributing to this big die-off of birds, which is not great news. So let's talk about something else.
Well, another great thing that's happening. Another challenge is microplastic pollution. I'm sure most of you have heard of microplastics, right? So this comes from a variety of sources. One source is plastic waste that breaks down into tiny pieces. And then also our clothing, a lot of our clothing sheds microplastic fibers, and that comes out in the wash, but it doesn't get captured in the process. And these fibers are too tiny for wastewater treatment plants to capture them. And so they just get into rivers and streams and lakes. And the reporting that we've done, scientists have found that these microplastic fibers and fragments are getting into organisms as small as phytoplankton, so really, really tiny creatures that are at the bottom of the food web. And they found that as bigger and bigger birds and fish eat the smaller organisms, those plastic pieces actually move up the food web. And also, microplastics have been found in human bodies as well. So we have microplastics in our blood and our lungs and our heart. Not all of us, probably, but heart tissue, even placentas. So this kind of pollution is really, really widespread in the environment. The problem is nobody really knows what that means yet. But this is another example of how what's happening in wildlife may have implications or clues to what's happening in humans, right? And one thing that, let me just see if I can find this for you. Some of the studies have found that there are microplastics in the food system, in the food that we eat. So even at the grocery store, right? So more processed food tends to have more microplastics in it. Food that is less processed tends to have less, but even fish caught, if you buy a fish, whole fish, for example, that can have plastic in it too. And even beer, and
Yeah,
water.
I've got a story about that. Go ahead. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
well, you tell that story. You did that story.
So there's a research out of the University of Minnesota. They tested Great Lakes beer and tap water from the same towns all across the region. And what they found is that, yes, there is microplastics in our tap water. There is microplastics in our beer, but there was no correlation between the sources. The city may have less plastic than the beer has more, or the beer may have less, and the city's water supply that they're using has more. And they couldn't figure out what is going on here. And some of you might know that I was doing a series of reports on distillers in the state on a program called Cheers. So I was asking this guy who was a distiller and a brewer, how could plastic be getting into the beer if it's not in the local water supply? And he said, oh God, all the grain comes in these big plastic bags, these polyethylene bags. So there's no grain in here that doesn't touch plastic at some point. And so I've been encouraging the Minnesota researchers, look into that. That might be your answer. And they haven't done it yet, but I'm telling you anecdotally, that's probably what's happening. That's why there's a difference between that. So you think about that Great Lakes beer, what could be more pure? You know, that's us. That's what we do. We're local beer people. We really have a latch on that. And yet we've got a real problem that nobody's come to a solution, because what's the easiest way to move grain? You know, we used to use burlap, but burlap gets holes in it. So you get these plastic polyethylene bags, which are much stronger, and you use those. That's the modern day way of handling grain. And again, we're paying a price for that. I mean, every time we do something we think is more efficient and economically sound, it ends up being something that's probably going to be a problem down the line. What are we talking about now? We're talking about lead?
Yeah, you want to do? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll talk about lead. So there's a study in Michigan, and they were looking at deaths of eagles. And they found that about 12% of all of the deaths in Michigan of eagles was due to lead poisoning. Now that's 176 birds over about a 15-year period, I think it was. So it's not like we're killing all the eagles. They're doing fine, right? But the way one researcher put it to me, we've got this resurgence of eagles. They're back. They're really, doing well. They're doing great. And at the same time, we're, full on, got the pedal to the metal. We're, all going forward on this. Somebody's pulling the brake, and we're seeing the population increase suppressed because they're dying of lead poisoning. So how do they get lead poisoning? Well, a few different ways. They like fish, right? They eat a lot of fish. Often in those areas, there's lost fishing tackle, and they can get exposed that way. More often, either a deer will be shot and the hunter can't track it down. And so I don't know if you know this, but eagles are scavengers. And so they'll eat that deer carcass, and the lead fragments from the bullet are in there. Also, we're seeing that when hunters dress their deer, field dress it, which basically is cutting it open, getting rid of all the organs out of it that they don't want. They just want the flesh. It's easy. It's easier to take home, and they leave that just in the field. Well, that lead is in there, and so the eagles will come and eat off of that field dressing and get poisoned that way. So there's a couple of different ways they're getting killed. We're also seeing that trumpeter swans. How many of you know about trumpeter swans? You know what they are? They're the largest waterfowl in North America. In 1968, there were 3,700 of them in all of North America. 3,700. Now, in the 19th century, They were really popular for their skin, for the meat, for the feathers, and so there were no hunting regulations, so they wiped them out in the entire Great Lakes region. There were only a few left in Western Canada and in Alaska. So this guy who works at the Kellogg Biological Station, which is the MSU research station, was looking at this problem and talking with some of his colleagues in other states and said, we can do something about this. I read a 1987 New York Times article about this guy who went to a zoo. There were a couple of trumpeter swans at this zoo. He got some eggs from the zoo, went on the plane, had a seat for the eggs, and kept running back to the lavatory with a hot water bottle and getting fresh, new, warm water to keep the eggs warm as he made the trip back to Michigan. I talked to that guy in 2000. He's gone now, but he was talking then about trumpeter swans are doing great. They're really doing great, in spite of the fact that they're running into wires and being electrocuted. They're being killed either out of vandalism or accidental identification, and they're dying of lead poisoning. And that's the first I'd heard of that. Trumpeter swans have really done well. They're back. There are like 63,000 of them now, up from 3,700. And I was talking to this pathologist, and she was showing me. In fact, you'll see it up here somewhere. There's a slide where she's showing me this digital X-ray of a trumpeter swan. I mean, these birds are big. You've seen Canada geese. These things are like 2.5 times bigger than Canada geese. And it had swallowed a big lead sinker, and it was in its system, and it slowly, it was toxic to its liver. It was stuck in its gizzard. He couldn't pass it, and it died. She was showing me all kinds of different x-rays. Some of them were really disturbing because one was a duck, and it had one shotgun pellet in its gizzard, and it couldn't pass it because it was stuck there. And it died from one lead pellet. Now, when you think about all the duck hunting we've done and all the goose hunting we've done in the same spots over and over and over for decades and decades and decades, there's a lot of shot in wetland areas. And swans and ducks, some ducks, dive down and get whatever's planted down in the sediment there, and they also end up swallowing lead. It's a real problem. And what's really bad about it is if you're taking duck home to your family, it might be toxic because it's already been infected, or not infected. Infected is the wrong word, but it's already got that coursing through its flesh. And you might be feeding it to your kids or your neighbors or whoever you're doing. And I'm not saying that it's going to kill anybody, but I'm saying that I don't think you want to be doing that to your friends and your neighbors and your kids. So there's a group called Sporting Lead Free that's been working for a long time with hunters and anglers. They are hunters and anglers, and they've all made the switch. They use copper for bullets. They use tungsten for lures and weights and things like that, so that if a bird or an eagle or a loon, lots of loons die from lead poisoning too, gets hold of it, it's not great, but they're not going to die of lead toxicosis. It's one thing they're taking away, saying, all right, we're doing our part. We're trying to make sure that these wild birds aren't poisoned by the ammunition or the fishing tackle that we're using, which I think is pretty wise. If you're a conservationist, if you're a true conservationist, that sounds like a pretty conservationist thing to do.
Well, I think the other thing that was surprising to me was that I thought there just wasn't as much lead available on the market anymore, Lester, but you found in your reporting that there was supposed to be a rule change, actually, at the end of the Obama administration, right? You want to tell what happened?
Yeah, the last couple of days, the Obama administration, the Interior Secretary set out a policy to phase out lead in all ammunition and fishing tackle. 2 days after the Trump administration came in, that policy was thrown out. So nothing's happened. There is, however, George H.W. Bush signed legislation that banned lead to be used for waterfowl hunting. So if you're hunting ducks or geese now, you can't use lead. You have to use steel shot or bismuth or something like that. So there has been some progress to make sure that we're continuing to, load up the wetlands with lead, but we still got a lot of other areas where it's still a problem. And until Congress or an Interior Secretary can make a policy, a regulation to stick, it's going to be that way. Or until hunters say, I know the tungsten's a little, or the steel shot's a little more expensive, or that the tackle's a little more expensive, but it's probably the right thing to do. But some of them are going to say, the government wants me to do that. I ain't doing anything the government wants me to do. And there you are. And
I think the lead story to me, in terms of the effect on birds, makes me think about something that I heard from Rolf Peterson. He's an emeritus professor at Michigan Tech, and he is one of the leaders of the longest running study of wolves and moose on Isle Royal. And he said to me many years ago that the simplest story is often irresistibly attractive. And that is especially true, I think, with environmental stories, because as you can see, bald eagles are doing much better. They have recovered from DDT poisoning, but they're scavengers, right? So then they get into lead, and that is causing, as Lester said, suppressing their populations. So I think it's important to remember in these kinds of stories that even the recovery stories can be complicated.
I've got one more story we'll tell you, and then I want Rebecca to tell you about her friends, the falcons in Kalamazoo. Was it Kalamazoo or Battle Creek?
Kalamazoo. Yep.
I was up in the UP talking with a Michigan DNR wildlife ecologist. Her name is Sherry McKinnon, really, really passionate person about conservation. And we talked for a long time about habitat depletion. We talked about colonial birds like those terns, those Caspian terns. The reason the avian flu goes through them so fast is they nest really close together. They're colony birds, they're colonial birds, and she's an expert on that. But the thing she told me that was really interesting that stuck with me was some of the birds are finding that their habitat's gone, so they're trying to find or force themselves onto habitat that's man-made. And one of those man-made habitat areas that they decide that they're going to try to nest on are spoil piles. And spoil piles can be dirt from construction or the dredging from a harbor or a river where there might have been decades of all kinds of pollution, and they dredge that up, they put it in a pile, the birds come along, and the DNR is finding that those eggs are PCB and dioxin laden. And you're thinking, how can we do this? How can we put this poisonous soil somewhere where wildlife can nest on it and try to feed from the organisms around it and think, oh, it's not a problem. We got to get this harbor dredged, got to put it someplace, this will be fine. But it's not. There's a price to be paid. So some birds are looking for habitat, some birds are making habitat, and some birds are doing it successfully.
Yeah, so how many of you know that we have peregrine falcons living in some of our cities in Michigan? Oh, a lot of you know this. Yeah, well, this is a birding crowd, right? I was on, speaking of our Michigan public trips that we do, our listener trips, I led a trip to Costa Rica in February. And one of the people who I met, turns out she is a volunteer for the peregrine falcon efforts in Kalamazoo. So there's a nest box on the side of the Fifth Third Bank in downtown Kalamazoo. And the falcons overall are doing much, much better. They were also another raptor that was affected by DDT. But because falcons normally nest on cliffs, they are also attracted to buildings and large structures. And when they nest on the side of a building, even if they have a nest box, the chicks that fledge right around Memorial Day weekend, they don't have their flight feathers fully emerged. And so they can kind of drift, but they might end up on a rooftop or they might end up in the street. And so what the volunteers do is they scoop them up and they take them to a rehab center where they call it flight school, and they wait till their flight feathers fully emerge. And those efforts have actually really been very successful in helping that particular nesting pair have better reproductive success.
Unless there's a kidnapping.
Yeah, there was a kidnapping once. Somebody scooped up a falcon baby off the street, and the volunteers had to get law enforcement involved to find it.
Who wants to take a falcon baby home? I mean, come on, that's just ridiculous. So, how many of you know about piping plovers? Yeah? Got some piping plover fans here? I've become a big fan of piping plovers. I really love those little birds. In 1985, there were only 13 nesting pairs left in the Great Lakes region. And now there's something like 80 pairs. And one of the things that we're finding is that because of climate change, some of the areas where they nest are being blown out by big storms. Now, let me tell you how they nest, because it's interesting. They go to a pebbly beach, they make this little bitty depression in the sand, and that's their nest. And when they have eggs, the eggs look like the pebbles. So it's supposed to fool the predators, right? But it doesn't usually. So because there are so few of them, when they come to Michigan, and most of them do come to Michigan to nest, the DNR and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Park Service put volunteers out to guard those birds as they nest. They put a little cage around them that they can get through in and out. And they make sure that people who are coming around with dogs know to keep their dogs leashed and away from the piping plovers. And they also kind of keep it up. There's a bird that's coming back that we're glad it's coming back, but it really likes piping plovers, called the merlin. Merlins like to eat piping plovers. So they're trying to find a balance and maybe prevent the merlin from getting a meal, but they're doing pretty well. But this new thing is we're seeing their habitat destroyed. I'll give you an example. Last fall, I was up at Whitefish Point. Do anybody know that place? It's in the UP. It's like 17 miles from where the Edmund Fitzgerald went down. And there's this point of beach and rock that goes way, way out. And that's where the piping plovers usually nest. And in November, the gales of November come early, the storm was so bad that it washed 2 acres of that sand and pebble away, and now it's all underwater. That's where the piping plovers nested. That's where they're going to look to nest. And the wildlife refuge folks don't know whether they're going to nest there this year. I need to call them and find out, because they're back right now. We also saw a big tropical storm, Gulf storm, come up through Lake Michigan when it was really high, about 4 years ago. And all of the piping plover nests on North Manitou Island were completely washed away. And what's bad about that is they'll try to re-nest. They're usually not very successful. And if they have to move somewhere else, the reproduction rate is usually down. So in a real way, climate change is fighting against this recovery of piping plovers. So there's another thing to worry about.
So Lester, looks like, Suzanne, do you want to start taking questions?
People ask questions following up on your lead commentary. Meredith wants to know, there are alternatives to lead, so why is lead still being used?
A couple of reasons. One is it's cheap. It's cheaper than tungsten. Tungsten's a little more expensive, quite a bit more expensive. And the other thing is it's what people have used. They have it. It's what they've always used. It's never. I don't use enough of it. It's going to hurt anything. Is usually the desire. And then back to that other reason is some people aren't going to change because the government wants them to change, or pinko liberal public radio people think it might be a good thing for them to change. They're not going to change. So it's either it's too expensive, I've always done it this way, or it's obstinance. But there are alternatives. And in fact, a friend of mine who fishes didn't know that this was an issue And he said, well, I wouldn't know where to get a tungsten. I'm like, I sent him 20 links to Amazon and a bunch of other places where he could get tungsten really easily. And it wasn't that expensive. It was a little more expensive than lead, but you know, that it's a change that people didn't know that it was even necessary or you know, preferred. But like I said, you've got varying people making various decisions about what they will and will not do to deal with this problem. And some of them just don't think it is a problem.
Do you have more questions, Suzanne, or do you want to open it up from the audience? Okay.
Questions?
We've told you everything we know. Good luck with getting an answer now.
First of all, I want to thank you for highlighting birds and coming to see. It's great.
We like IPSI.
The issue with lead ammunition is one that concerns me greatly. We have a very falling population of hunters, probably about 6% of Michiganders hunt. So why are we letting that 6% drive our environmental issues? We know that is a problem not only for birds, but for humans. It's one of those chemicals that gets into the water. So I don't think it's as easy as saying they just don't want to. I think that as an environmental movement, there needs to be a push for the DNR or the state of Michigan to mandate stopping the use of lead ammunition. There are alternatives, they're not that much more expensive, and we're talking about only 6% of the population.
I will say there's one thing that hunters will tell you is that when they use steel shot, for example, on their shotgun, it's a lot rougher on the barrel. And so that the life of that shotgun is going to be cut, right? That's a concern of theirs. And you know, it's fairly legitimate. I don't think that it justifies that. Now I'm making an opinion. Reporters aren't supposed to have an opinion. I think if they just thought about it for a second, that the little bit of wear and tear on that shotgun is going to be a lot better than bringing a duck or goose home that's got lead shot in it. Other questions? Comments?
So exciting now.
We did such a good job, Rebecca. Nobody has any questions or comments at all. No, seriously. I teach at, not to teach, I speak at universities quite a bit. And I'll get into a situation like this. And I'm like, okay, you guys all want to be journalists. And I just open up the questions and nobody's giving me a question. Here's your turn to flip the switch on us. You guys can be the journalists and you can ask us the question. So go for it.
Hello. So I have a question about like what could be done for, or more like about the smaller like invasive bird species, so like house sparrows, starlings, that kind of stuff, or is that kind of just like, I don't know, is there anything about that?
Yeah, my wife would show you how to chase starlings out of the yard. It's funny, it's hilarious. You get out of here. But that isn't, it's not very effective. I don't know what we can do about the invasive species that have come in. I mean, it's like we've got all kinds of invasive species that range from, I don't know, cats to birds that people brought in because I used to live in England and I love the starlings. The starlings should be here where I live now, and I'm going to bring them back. They're here to stay for the most part. And there are so many different kinds of sparrows. How do you single out the one that's an invasive versus the other ones? I mean, we're feeding all of them except for the starlings. I'm serious. She's religious about going out chasing away starlings from the bird feeder. And I laugh every time.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Somebody had mentioned something about making up only 6% of the population, but it's the hunters that are making most of the money towards preserving land. So that's what you need to think about.
So this is a very good point, and something I talked to Sherry McKinnon about. So in Minnesota, they actually have a very small tax. It's like 0.01% on binoculars and on outdoorsy type stuff. And that way they're not as reliant on just anglers and hunters for habitat restoration or any of the other things that they use that money for. Because, I mean, right now, the Michigan DNR, they know who pays the bills. The hunters do. The anglers do. That's where they get the bulk of their money for working. The legislature isn't giving them a lot. They give them a little bit for the state parks. They give them a little bit for some of the other things, projects that are going on. But their job is to make sure that when they establish a wetland, it's for ducks and geese, not secretive marsh birds or, you know, piping plovers or something like that. They know their job is to shape this natural area into an area that will attract the things that hunters want to shoot. And why wouldn't they think that way? I mean, that's the way it's been for as long as the state has had a DNR. They will tell you, and they're not ashamed of it, that, you know, the hunters drive our agenda. So I think the only thing that you can do is do something like Minnesota and say, okay, I'll pay a little extra. I'm a wildlife photographer. I'll pay a tax on a lens to make sure that some of this habitat is set aside for the kind of things I want to see, the natural things.
I think you said that the talk is associated with a documentary, which I didn't realize. I'm wondering if you can tell us more about where we can view or listen to the documentary.
I'm glad you asked. Go ahead.
All right. So it's actually going to air. It's a radio documentary. It'll air next Monday on Memorial Day during the stateside time slot, so 3 p.m. and 8 p.m. And then also there will be 3 online segments that will come out
Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. They'll be out. We'll do one on disease, one on pollution, one on habitat loss. We are also sharing this documentary with any of the public radio stations who want to use it for free. And we're also putting it up on PRX, which is a nationwide thing for all the Great Lakes stations who might want to do it. And again, we're offering it for free.
Lester, so if I'm not a hunter and I'm not a plastics manufacturer, but I care about this issue and I want to do something myself at home, what can I do?
Well, Reb talked about some of the things we can do for birds to protect them, like put decals on your windows so they don't bash into your windows. You should see my house. We've got one area where it's like all glass sliding doors. We've got stickers all over those things, and they're cute. They're little leaf shapes, and they're made so they look white to us, but to birds, it's like this big neon thing that they see. There's a new building, a fairly new building at Wayne State University. If you ever go into downtown Detroit, you'll see this thing. It looks like it's like trees on the windows for 4 stories. That was put there so birds wouldn't crash into the windows. We have a situation right here in Ypsi. There's a courthouse that is notorious for birds crashing into it. It's just bad. And I keep thinking, why doesn't somebody go to the county board and say, hey, we've had enough of this. We counted 300 birds last year dead on the pavement at the base of your building. Why aren't you doing something about that? That's a public building. That's something you have a vested interest in. Why isn't somebody doing that? I've done this story. I've suggested to people, here's a problem. And I don't think anything was done about it. And it's still happening. So I think that anywhere that you see a glass building, especially if it's a publicly owned glass building, you should be checking to see, ask the local Audubon folks, ask the birders in your area, are there dead birds there? In Chicago, they have a patrol every day. They go around and they pick up the dead birds and they keep track of them so they can keep pressure on the commercial buildings and the public buildings and the city council to do something about this. And they have done some things. They've dimmed the lights during migratory periods. They've done things like that. And it doesn't take a lot sometimes, you know, if the lights are attracting the birds at night, turn off the lights overnight. That's pretty easy if it's not a 24-hour operation. So there are lots of things that you can do. Keep your cat inside is another one that Reb mentioned.
Plant native species is
Yeah.
an easy one. Also drink shade-grown coffee for migratory birds.
Yeah.
Is one more thing. Cut down on single-use plastic. And you can also get involved in data collection. So you can join backyard bird counts if you don't do that already. That is actually really, really important. And the reason why we know so much about birds is a lot of that is due to citizen science.
Yeah, that whole study that came out 5 years ago, a lot of that was citizen science. That data, so many people going out counting birds during the Christmas bird count or during, you know, the migratory bird count. That stuff gives them real hard numbers. It's not just, you know, a guess. They've got data now to say the population of the Kirtland warbler is down a lot. You know, by the way, that was not part of what we were studying, not a waterbird, but that's been a nice little recovery story, because if you go up around Gaylord, they've been planting these little, what kind of pine tree is it? Jack pine. They only like it till they're like 5 years old. There are so many big fields, huge fields, groves of little jack pine trees in different places around the Gaylord and the Great Lake area, and it's fun to see that you know, here's our state dollars actually at work to do something. It was a very popular movement, you know, because a Michigander named the bird, you know, and so we feel some ownership for it. It breeds in our state, it nests here, and so it was a big, expensive movement. A lot of public dollars, a lot of private dollars going in to make it happen. But that's a good success story. We can do it. But I think a lot of times it's just awareness. You know, how many people actually understand that some of these things are problems? We got a question over here. Oh, sorry.
Yes, way back in the beginning of your presentation, you gave us the 3 billion with the B number of birds that have died in a year.
No, had died since 1970.
Oh, since 1970.
Yeah, and we also in our doc we figured out, you know, that was 5 years ago. So if nothing has changed, that means another 300 million birds has died.
Well, I guess my question is about that rate of change. Do you have any baseline number for what the rate of the death rate would have been 50 years ago or 100 years ago?
Well, at 1970, we're talking about 50 years ago. Yeah, I know. I have that trouble too. We're there. I'm gonna abandon you for a second. The beer is catching up with me.
If you have any questions about Lester, now is a good time to ask me. All right. What questions do you have? Oh, and a few more in the back. Are they all about Lester? Because it's good. Yeah.
I just have a quick suggestion for your neighbors with cats. I tried to tell them not to feed the birds and let the cat out. When I told them it was like coyote in the neighborhood, they kept
Molly, did you make that up? Was it true? No, it was? Okay.
I just want to say, I heard it at NPR last week. There was a group of college students who just won a $20,000 grant because they developed a filter for inside washing machines for microplastics. I don't know if you're talking about that one. I was never proud of my bridge, but so I thought that was pretty neat that science is happening and that changes hopefully coming soon.
Yeah, in fact, Lester, who is not with us at the moment, did a story about the microplastics in beer story that he did, there is a filter that you can buy to put in your washing machine to cut down on the fibers that come out of your clothes. And another question in the back here.
I just wanted to quickly revisit the lead in ammunition issue. Someone refuted saying that hunters pay for conservation. Just to be clear, he's referring to the Pittman-Robertson Act, which is started in 1937, when the only people who owned guns were hunters. But now there's a tax on all guns and all ammo. So most of your street guns and things like that are what pay for conservation, not the small percentage of Michiganders that hunt. I am not anti-hunting at all. In fact, I wish we had a lot more deer hunters in Southeast Michigan. But I do think it's on us as a community, I myself am a hunter, to stop the use of lead ammunition. It's a simple thing to do. It benefits everyone. And could we really argue, even if the Pittman-Robertson Act were all hunters funding conservation, could we really argue that that's okay? Because they pay for it, so they're allowed to pollute the earth? I don't think so. So again, we've got a very small percentage of people that are refusing to take away lead ammunition, which is a known hazard to everyone in this room.
To your point, one of the researchers we talked to, she was a deer hunter, and she was said, we're taught you have one target. And if you get your deer and something else dies, you've done something wrong. You've got one target. It's not a bald eagle, you know? And so I think that, again, getting back to what is conservation, what is a conservationist? You know, they have to be aware that the action is not stopping right there at that deer. There are consequences after that. So I think if they can embrace that, and I think a lot of them are, this group, Lead-Free Sporting, is really committed to convincing their peers this is the better way to go. Well, let's do this. So we'll see if that helps. I mean, there's nothing better than peer pressure when you're dealing with changing somebody's habit, right? Hey, while I've got the microphone, because Reb steals it all the time, I want to point out there was a dapper young man back there who asked the question earlier, and he is our editor for this project. He's also our news director. That is Vincent Duffy. Stand up, Vincent. And next to him is our new-ish general manager, Wendy Turner. Okay, do we have more questions? Do you answer questions? Were any of them about me?
Nobody has any questions about
Okay,
you.
good.
Suzanne, do you have more from online?
There are a few comments online. Hiram Williams is saying, as certain bird species decline, their prey may multiply. What do we know about the biologic consequences of decline in specific populations? Do you have any examples?
That's my dad asking a question. I better get this right. Can you tell me that again?
As certain bird species decline, their prey may multiply. What do we know about the biologic consequences of declines in specific populations?
It depends on the population, right? I mean, if you take terns, for example, we talked about the Caspian terns. Other terns are doing great. So it's the behavior of the bird that has a lot to do with their decline, as well as the environment around them. So it's different for every species. Even groups of birds that behave much alike, hang out the same places, they could have dramatically different population or reproduction issues. You know, some may be doing great, some may be doing really poorly. So it's not an easy answer.
Another comment from Dorothy McLear. The birding community is often overlooked as a source of tourism income. We need to increase awareness that the money then our money isn't as great as anyone's.
I'm not going to argue with that.
Hey, Suzanne, you have a question in the front here. If you...
Yeah, so the state of Michigan has a couple special shaped plates. Two of them I have the wildlife fund. I think it used to have a loon. Now it has a moose on the graphic, and the other is the Ducks Unlimited. Can you comment on what that money does, where the extra money goes? Where's the money go, and how it used to conserve these populations?
I think that goes to the Natural Resource Commission, doesn't it?
I actually don't know the answer to that.
So the Ducks Unlimited one is an interesting one because they benefit from that a little bit, and everybody thinks of the Ducks Unlimited as a hunters group, and it is in a form, but it's more of a conservation group. They are responsible for most of the wetland restoration that's going on. If the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service gets a bunch of money to establish a new wetland at Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge, they call Ducks Unlimited, say, okay, we need your expertise. How should we go about this and make our money work the best? And that's what Ducks Unlimited does. They're really, really good at establishing wetlands. Now, these wetlands do benefit some of these birds that we've been talking about, you know, egrets and herons and things like that, but they're not made specifically for them. They're made to encourage more ducks and geese. But there is a side benefit. It's not like the other birds don't benefit at all. I've gone out to Shiawassee a lot of times, and I've seen shorebirds that I see nowhere else running around in the mud there. Also, there are, especially in the wintertime, you're not supposed to, you have to hike in the winter. You could see 30 eagles in an afternoon at Shiawassee if you're walking there in December or January, something like that. It's amazing how many there are around there. Most of them are juveniles. They're kind of funky looking, but they're eagles too. They're nice. They're good. But Ducks Unlimited is a really interesting group because I did not understand them at first. I just thought it's a hunters group, you know, but it's not. It's much more than that. And they handle, there was recently some money released by the state for establishing wetlands to benefit Lake Erie. More wetlands, more areas. So they asked for private groups to submit things in, and Ducks Unlimited was administrating all of that. They are the experts. They know what project should be approved and what shouldn't be approved. What's going to be beneficial to keep fertilizer and nutrients getting into Lake Erie. Is that something that's going to benefit wildlife and benefit the lake? Okay, that's a project that we think should be funded, and we'll tell the government, you know, this is a good place where they can spend their money. So they have a really intricate relationship with government and with hunters and with conservationists and wetland restoration folks. It is not the group I thought it was when I first started covering this 10 years ago. And that's off your question. I can't answer you about exactly where that money goes. I know it is earmarked, and it is earmarked for habitat and wildlife preservation, but the DNR has so many different little pockets of money that can only be used on certain things. So where that lands exactly, who's responsible for spending that money, it is beyond me. Mr. Krapinski. No, you really don't. This guy's only working radio for like most of his life, so.
So I have a question about Canada geese.
Yeah.
Which in a lot of ways would be considered a huge success story.
Absolutely.
Compared to 40, 50 years ago where it was hard to find them. And now it seems that Canada geese have moved into the realm of being nuisance species in a lot of suburban and urban areas. And is that just because of the resilience of the geese being adapted to that, or is that related to fewer hunters that are hunting the geese? And it's like the pendulum is really swung through at least in my opinion, geese.
So first of all, I don't understand why you have something against these cobra chickens. So yes, they are a nuisance, and people in the suburbs get tired of accidentally stepping into goose poo and all that stuff. They are a success story in that not only did their population, because they were almost wiped out, they were restored, but they also, like raccoons and deer, found a way to adapt to the urban area. Coyotes are learning that now. So it's one of those things where, okay, we want them, we just don't want them in our backyard. But, you know, so I don't know what to tell you. I don't have a problem with geese. You do. So I wear hiking boots all the time. So it's not going to be an issue for me. But yeah, I know people. I mean, some people are actually just scared of them. There's a woman in Ann Arbor, and I can't remember her name, but she was really, really upset because these darn turkeys are scaring the kids. You know, turkeys in Ann Arbor, they're not here. Turkeys are another one that, you know, they were almost wiped out. Now they've come back and they figured out, hey, we can live in the town too, because there's places to go eat there, especially if, you know, you've got bird feeders or the birds are scattering seed all over. That's easy pickings for turkeys. So it's, you know, it's a price we pay as a society. But just keep in mind, those Canada geese were in those places long before Europeans decided to move there. It's just like the people, there's this woman who moved out to a place called, it's literally the road was Rattlesnake Lane. And she was just outraged that there were little Massasauga rattlesnakes in that area. Why didn't somebody tell her? The other one is a new subdivision went in near this nice water area, wet area, and everybody was planting their trees. And suddenly these animals came up and they were gnawing at them and chopping them down. Nobody should have beavers here. That's not why we moved here. We didn't move here for beavers. And there's story after story after story like that. It's just, it's hilarious, I think. But I wish you good fortune and companionship with the geese in your neighborhood. Yeah, you get more coyotes, you'll have fewer geese. That'll take care of it. Yeah. All right. Have we covered everything?
Who here wants to hear Lester imitate some bird calls?
The photos you've seen up there, the limits are my talent. That's about it. Although our producer, she had a bird call that was used for every bird that we mentioned. And it was just fascinating. They all say, caw-caw, caw-caw. That's Zoe. Zoe pulled that on us like, well, what's a loon sound like? Caw-caw, caw-caw. By the way, that was what I knew I was going to do this documentary on vacation. I went up to Savannah Wilderness with my kayak and paddled around until I could get some loon calls. And you know, you're not allowed to paddle up to them, but what I found out is they're curious. They'll come up to you and you can get really good photos of them. And then you come back at like 2 o'clock in the morning and you set a recorder out and you go back in your truck where you're a little warmer and you wait a half hour and maybe a loon will call and you can get it. So it was one of the best vacations I've ever had, even though it was cold and nobody told me about the gnats in the Western UP in May. That was amazing. I've learned about head nets. I didn't know about those. Yeah, I grew up on a farm, but in Illinois, where, you know, the wilderness is corn and soybeans. Michigan, I've been here for 2 decades now, and I have to tell you, I think of this state as my home now, and I am constantly finding new treasures in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula and all over the Upper Peninsula. I could die happy and never leave the boundaries. I love this state. I just love going out and taking photographs and watching things. And I was up in Iron County a couple of years ago, and I found wolf prints, and bona fide wolf prints. They were fresh. It had rained the night before. It was in the sand. I measured them. They were big. And then I found a big pile of scat. And I was telling this USDA guy, hey, over in your national forest over there, I saw wolf prints. I didn't see the wolf. He saw you. I told my wife, I said, if I got killed by a wolf in the UP, that's a lot better way than dying in a nursing home. I'd take that. That'd be all right with me. All right, I'm out of stories. And that's saying something. I want to thank you very much for coming out. We appreciate it. We appreciate your support of Michigan Public. I got to tell you, I love the fact that the stuff I do mostly now doesn't use your money, so it can go other places for the other reporters, because I'm supported by CS Mott Foundation. But I do appreciate the fact that you're giving and that you're supporting this, and coming to events like this tells us that we're doing something of value for you, and it's a confirmation for us. Keeps us going. I mean, most of our time is spent in a little studio talking to a microphone with nobody there, right? And we're just imagining that you're out there. It's nice to see concrete evidence that you're actually out there. So thanks for coming out.
Thank you very much.